Hello everyone, today we will step into the echoing halls of a medieval court, where law is spoken in measured tones, but justice waits in silence, patient and sharp. Picture this: a man in crimson robes, silver hair combed back with ceremonial care, lifting a gavel as petitioners kneel before him. He speaks of fairness. He weighs evidence. He offers verdicts like scripture. But behind that robe, beneath that solemn voice, something festers. And in a kingdom where the king watches everything, no sin hides forever. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the punishment fit the crime? The man was Sisamnes, a name that once inspired trust. A judge of high station in ancient Persia, he presided over cases large and small with the authority of the king himself. The people who came before him brought disputes of inheritance, of land, of stolen goods and broken promises. They bowed deeply. They spoke humbly. For most, he was the last voice they would hear before their fates were sealed. But power, once acquired, rarely stays pure. Sisamnes was not born into justice. He had earned his position through loyalty, cunning, and an early career of strict rulings that pleased the court. For years, he appeared incorruptible. But as his status grew, so did his hunger, not for more wisdom, but for more wealth. Bribes began as whispers. A small gift here, a favor there. A nobleman's messenger with a sealed pouch and a polite nod. Nothing official. Nothing written. And always, Sisamnes judged in favor of those who could afford his favor. He had a gift for making the corruption seem invisible. When he ruled against the poor, he cited obscure laws, ancient customs. When he freed the guilty, he cloaked it in language so dense no one dared question it. And he never took too much at once. Just enough to remind the powerful he could be bought, if they knew how to ask. Over time, the courtroom changed. Fewer commoners came forward. More cases were settled before they ever reached his bench. The whispers turned to warnings. Don't waste your time. He's already been paid. But the king, Cambyses, said nothing. He observed. He let the lie grow fat on its own indulgence. And so Sisamnes, unaware he was being watched, continued. There was one case, small, forgettable, that began the unraveling. A merchant accused a court official of extortion. The case was dismissed within the hour. No witnesses heard. No cross-examination. The merchant was fined for slander. Days later, the official was seen passing a heavy purse to a rider who delivered it directly to the judge's estate. But Sisamnes didn't flinch. He had grown comfortable. Untouchable. He believed the red robe of his office was armor, that the king would never dare question the hand that served his laws. He was wrong. One morning, without notice, a royal scribe arrived. A letter was handed to Sisamnes as he prepared to take his seat in court. It bore the seal of King Cambyses himself. Sisamnes opened it. And his hands began to tremble. The letter contained no accusation, no demand for explanation. Just a summons. Immediate. Final. He was not to finish the day's cases. He was to report to the palace chambers, alone. There were no guards. No horns. No spectacle. Just a hallway growing narrower with every step. He passed beneath towering murals of justice, scales held aloft, blindfolded figures cast in marble. Symbols he had once honored, now watching with silent condemnation. And still, he did not know how bad it would get. Because some punishments are not meant to correct. They are meant to be remembered. Sisamnes entered the royal hall not as a judge, but as a man peeled of privilege. The chamber was silent as he stepped forward, his ceremonial sash still tied across his chest, an illusion of dignity he clung to like armor. But no armor would save him now. King Cambyses sat on a throne of black stone, carved with images of wolves devouring serpents, symbols of order consuming deceit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rage. He simply stared at Sisamnes, eyes as sharp as drawn steel. "You know why you're here," the king said, his voice level, empty of emotion. Sisamnes bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, if I have erred—" "You have not erred," Cambyses interrupted. "You have traded judgment for coin. Sold justice like cattle in a market. You used my authority to fatten your purse. And worse." His voice grew colder. "You thought I wouldn't see." There were no excuses. No denials. Sisamnes knew the walls were closing. He dropped to his knees, robe puddling like spilled blood around him. "Mercy," he whispered. But the king was not there for mercy. "I have trusted you with my people's lives," Cambyses said. "You judged men for theft while you pocketed gold behind the bench. You sentenced the guilty while committing crimes from your seat. So now, Sisamnes, you will be judged." He signaled the guards. 2 men stepped forward, not palace guards, but royal executioners. They did not carry swords. Instead, they held leather cords and iron hooks, tools not for killing, but for removing. Sisamnes' eyes widened. He had heard rumors of punishments reserved for traitors. But judges? Never. Not one. "You will not die," the king said. "Not quickly. Not quietly." Sisamnes tried to rise, but the guards seized him. His gavel hand was bound first. His robes were torn away, ripped at the seam, exposing flesh that had once delivered law but now shook with dread. "You will be flayed alive," Cambyses continued, "so the law may remember what it means to be betrayed by its own tongue." Flayed alive. The words settled over the chamber like falling ash. Sisamnes screamed, not in pain, not yet, but in comprehension. This was no ordinary execution. This was a warning. And it would not be done in a dungeon or behind a curtain. It would be done in the very court he once ruled. The procession began. Stripped and trembling, Sisamnes was dragged through the halls he once walked in pride. Judges averted their eyes. Scribes paused their quills. No one spoke. The red carpet he had once used to enter the courtroom now ran wet with sweat and bare footsteps. The courtroom was already prepared. At the center, where once his chair had sat, a raised platform had been built, low, wide, and made of cedar. Not for dignity. For display. They bound him spread-eagle on the platform. Not roughly. Deliberately. With the precision of men used to turning punishment into permanence. He begged. He cried out the names of his children. He called upon the gods of justice. But no one answered. The executioners stepped forward. From a brass basin they withdrew thin, hooked knives shaped not to stab, but to lift. The first incision was shallow, just below the shoulder. A ribbon of skin peeled back, and Sisamnes howled. The noise reverberated against the stone. But the king had given strict orders, keep him alive for every inch. And so the work continued. A court once meant for truth had become a theater of pain. But Cambyses did not watch in hatred. He watched in lesson. For nearby stood Sisamnes' replacement, his own son Otanes. The boy stood frozen, forced to watch as each strip of his father's skin was removed, not in fury, but with clinical care. His eyes were wide. He did not look away. The king made sure of that. "Remember this," Cambyses said softly to the boy. "Not his screams. Not his shame. But what justice becomes, when its keeper sells it." Hours passed. By the end, Sisamnes' voice was gone. His body, once draped in velvet and gold, lay slack and raw. And yet, it was not thrown to the dogs or burned in the pit. It had a different purpose. One that would live longer than his name. The courtroom was silent again. Not because the screams had faded, those would echo in dreams for generations, but because what came next was quieter, colder, and far more enduring than pain. Sisamnes' body lay still, a hollow thing on the cedar platform. The executioners, sweat gleaming on their brows, moved not with reverence but with ritual. Each strip of skin was carefully removed, stretched, and placed into a waiting cloth-lined chest. There was no blood pooling any more. The man who had once passed judgment on kings and beggars alike had been unmade. But his punishment, his true punishment, had only begun. The king rose from his throne and stepped toward the remains. No one moved. Not the scribes. Not the guards. Even the flies held their breath. "Let him become the seat of law," Cambyses said. The command was understood immediately. Under the king's orders, the court's master artisan, an old man known for shaping bone, horn, and wood into instruments of both beauty and horror, was summoned. He took the skin. He bowed. And he left without speaking a word. The courtroom was cleaned, but not entirely. The cedar platform was dismantled, but one dark stain remained, burned in as if by heatless fire. No one dared scrub it. For days, judgment was suspended. The red robes of the court hung untouched on their pegs, as if mourning their wearer. And then, the chair arrived. It was brought under heavy cloth, carried by 6 men with veils over their faces. It was placed at the center of the courtroom, where Sisamnes had once sat. And when the cloth was removed, even the stone walls seemed to exhale. It was a throne of horror and warning. The wooden structure had been wrapped in human leather, stitched seamlessly, carefully, unflinchingly. The arms bore the faint texture of a man's forearms. The seat, a patchwork of skin so tightly drawn it creaked. The backrest bore his name. Not carved. Branded. Sisamnes. It wasn't a secret. The king made no effort to hide the truth. In fact, it was the point. He ordered that every petitioner who entered the court must know who now served as its foundation. He wanted the people to sit in silence, not because they feared the law, but because they now knew exactly what happened when the law was betrayed. And into that chair was placed a new figure. Otanes. The son. He was not given time to grieve. No ceremony, no trial period, no mourning cloak. The very day the chair was delivered, he was ordered to sit. His father's replacement. His father's warning. He lowered himself onto the seat with trembling legs. It was warm. The skin groaned beneath his weight. He did not speak for a full hour. The court waited breathless. Then he lifted the gavel, once held by his father, and called the first case. His voice was even. His judgment swift. And from that day forward, Otanes became known not for kindness, but for clarity. He never took a bribe. He never looked away when injustice stood before him. He never forgot the weight beneath him. The people, at first, whispered about the chair in horror. But over time, horror turned to awe. Justice was now incorruptible. Not because of fear alone, but because the seat itself had memory. A living reminder. A flesh and wood god of consequence. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. Sisamnes had believed himself immune. He had thought robes protected him. That power made him invisible. But he was wrong. The law had eyes. And now, it had skin. The chair of judgment remained. Year after year, season after season, ruler after ruler, the skin-wrapped seat of justice sat at the center of the court like a fossilized curse. Its color deepened over time, the stretched flesh hardening, darkening, resisting decay. Attempts to replace it were denied. Cambyses had made his intention clear. So long as men are tempted by gold, let them see what awaits the hand that reaches for it. Otanes, son of Sisamnes, ruled from it for 23 years. His legacy was sharp-edged, neither loved nor hated, respected. He never married. Never took gifts. Never ruled in haste. But he was not his father's opposite. He was his lesson. And every time his fingers rested on the chair's carved arms, every time he paused in silence before rendering verdict, the weight of what lay beneath him pressed upward like breath through stone. He died in that chair. Not violently. Not tragically. Simply still. One winter morning, his heart stopped mid-sentence. His final words were a ruling in favor of a farmer whose land had been seized by a noble. The court fell quiet. The gavel dropped from his fingers. His body remained upright for a full minute before it slumped. The chair was not removed. It was cleaned, anointed, polished, then passed to the next judge. It became tradition. And it became known. Foreign emissaries who visited the court were brought to see it, not hidden away, but placed prominently behind velvet ropes. They were told the story of Sisamnes. Some doubted it. Others turned pale. One ambassador from the eastern provinces refused to enter the chamber at all, muttering prayers in his tongue as he backed away. But the people remembered. The story passed through generations like an heirloom, retold beside hearths and in schoolrooms, carved into the margins of parchment texts. Artists depicted the flaying in murals, sometimes with horror, sometimes with reverence. In time, it became more than punishment. It became myth. And myths, like wounds, have ways of reopening. Centuries passed. The chair remained. Judges came and went. Some wore their robes with humility, others with pride. Most, at first, treated the chair with reverence. But as the years distanced them from the original act, a strange arrogance returned. One magistrate, young, ambitious, popular, declared the chair outdated. A superstition, he said. A barbaric relic. He proposed its removal and ordered a new seat to be built, marble and gold, etched with the emblem of modern law. But the chair would not leave quietly. During the ceremony to remove it, workers claimed to hear groans when they touched its arms. One fainted. Another lost a finger when a strap snapped and crushed his hand. The magistrate insisted on continuing the removal, but by the end of the week, he was found dead in his chambers. Not murdered. Not poisoned. His throat had closed. Some said from a rare illness. Others said from the weight of judgment. The chair was returned. After that, no one spoke of replacing it again. Instead, it took on a new name, not just the chair of judgment, but the seat of skin. A name spoken quietly, with half a shiver. And though some still mocked it as old folklore, none ever sat upon it without hesitation. But perhaps the most haunting legacy came not from the chair itself, but from what it symbolized. Because Sisamnes' story wasn't about a single man's greed. It was about what happens when the law is betrayed from within. When the very figures meant to protect the people instead prey upon them. And how, sometimes, a punishment must be so unforgettable that it etches itself into the future. Even now, when courtrooms far removed from Persia render verdicts, echoes of Sisamnes remain. In every oath to uphold justice. In every hesitation before a dishonest judgment. In every gavel strike that follows a long, tense pause. The law, after all, has many weapons. Some are written in ink. Others are stitched in flesh. The centuries turned, but the tale of Judge Sisamnes did not fade. Long after the chair was no longer used, after kings gave way to councils and courts moved from stone halls into marble-lined chambers, the legend endured, not because it was retold, but because it refused to be forgotten. It didn't live on parchment alone. It lived in silence. In hesitation. In the long breath a judge takes before rendering a verdict that might ruin a life. In modern courtrooms, far from ancient Persia, the name Sisamnes is almost never spoken aloud. But it is known. Students of law study it, whispered at the edges of ethics lectures as a parable too grotesque to be ignored. Some treat it as myth. Others, as truths shrouded in theater. But all understand what it means, that the justice system is only as sacred as the men and women who guard it, and just as vulnerable to rot. The chair itself, wrapped in human skin, no longer stands. At least, not publicly. Some say it was destroyed during one of the empire's many collapses. Others claim it was hidden away, sealed in a vault beneath what is now a government building. A few whisper it was burned, but would not burn. Whatever its fate, its image remains. Etchings of the punishment, grisly but restrained, appear in old illuminated manuscripts, tucked between verses of law. Renaissance painters depicted the flaying as a moral fable, placing Sisamnes front and center, surrounded by judges and citizens, all looking on as skin is slowly drawn from flesh. But even in those paintings, something more chilling lingers, the presence of Otanes, the sun, watching. Always watching. Because the horror of Sisamnes' punishment wasn't just the act itself. It was the legacy. The judgment didn't end with pain. It continued with remembrance. It reached into the next generation and forced them to carry the burden of justice, not with pride, but with fear. A fear of what happens when justice is sold. A fear of what follows when you forget the cost. And yet, the world forgets. Again and again, power corrupts. Bribes find their way into systems. Favors become currency. Judges fall. Leaders lie. And every time, the story of Sisamnes flickers back to life, not as history, but as warning. In one such courtroom, a mural was discovered behind plaster during renovations. It showed a robed figure faceless, bound at the wrists. Around him, shadows held knives. And behind them, barely visible unless the light caught it just right, the faint outline of a flayed man's skin, stretched, nailed into the frame of a great wooden chair. No one claimed to have painted it. No one admitted to knowing how long it had been there. But the image, once seen, stayed. Because there is something uniquely terrifying about a punishment designed not for death, but for legacy. Cambyses, in his brutal wisdom, knew that fear fades when it dies with the body. But when it is displayed, when it speaks through silence, it becomes eternal. And in the silence that follows injustice, Sisamnes still waits. Not to be mourned. Not to be forgiven. But to remind every hand that dares touch the scales of judgment that the skin of law, once torn, never forgets.